you have been speaking out against Islam, but this started in September.
Mm-hmm.
You have said extremely provocative things by anyone's standard, in even your own, I would say, or maybe I'll ask you about that. But like you say, you've been calling the Prophet Muhammad a paedophile.
Factual.
There's various videos of you with goats and sort of baiting Muslims in a sort of I don't know what exactly with the goats, but you've said
leave the goats alone. That's my tagline.
Right, and implying that they're goat shaggers.
Goat shaggers, yeah. Well, they invented the condom, but with the goat intestines. But the Romans had the good sense to take out the goat first.
You've said Islam is incompatible with the West, no Sharia law ever. You said in China, mosques are turned into public toilets.
Mm-hmm.
You said it's time for a crusade. Islam is humanity's greatest disgrace. It didn't come to the UK to eat dirty Islamic camel meat. I've never regret doing this. Islam must be kicked out of the West. So you're saying extremely provocative things.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is your motivation here? Are you a provocateur? Is this a free speech crusade that you're on? Is Islam the real concern for you? What exactly are you doing here?
I criticize Islam simply because I've got an IQ of over 70. Islam, if you read the Quran, if you read the Quran and the Hadith, and you can go even further, you can read the Musnad. It's an awful system, and we should be able to critique evil systems. It makes no sense to me that somebody is worshipping, as I said, a pedophile warlord. That's in their Hadith 5134. He has sex slaves. He was a warlord of 83 wars. It makes no sense to me that this is allowed. Their propaganda is taking over. The UK, the United Kingdom, a country that I absolutely love, gave me a home. You've got a British MP. I don't call him British. He's a Pakistani MP in House of Parliament, and he's wanting. He was debating the benefits of cousin marriages.
Yeah,
it makes no sense. Iqbal Muhammad, MP Iqbal Muhammad, and then the NHS had a poster explaining, yes, cousin marriages can be beneficial for communities.
Mm-hmm.
Bullshit.
Yeah.
It's like, why? This is the last, there's been many last straws. I'm surprised that more people haven't, many people speak up. I think I just happen to have a bit of an odd face, and people are like, yeah.
When did you first look into Islam?
I actually, I was very interested in languages since I was young. I speak a bit of Russian, German, English, Korean. And I just thought, what's this funny pigtail language, Arabic? And I wonder if I can try and decode it a bit. So funnily enough, I accidentally became a Muslim, because if you say, Ashhadu ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, if you say 3 times, you become a Muslim. So I'm probably the worst Muslim there is. But I was interested in the language, and then I started reading the Quran. I thought, surely it couldn't be as bad as people say. But then when you study it, you get verses such as Surah 4, verse 34, which says, if you fear disobedience from a woman, admonish her, forsake her in bed, and strike her. If you just fear disobedience from a woman, shows you why perhaps some of these cultures treat the woman in the way that they do and turn them into letterboxes. Awful. In Afghanistan, not only are they put in this hideous letterbox dress, which is just to dehumanize them, they've decided that this slit is not going far enough. They've covered one eye in Afghanistan. They cover one eye of the slit, so they can only see from one eye. Absolutely awful.
Okay, so how old were you when you started trying to decode Arabic and then get into Islam?
I've always been interested in it since maybe like young 20s. But maybe even earlier. I was a massive fan of Christopher Hitchens. I'm your Timu Christopher Hitchens.
Okay, so and then at some point along the way, you have made a decision to go public with your opinions.
Yes.
Now, you've told me when that first occasion was, which is in September, Australia TV. But at what point were you thinking, I'm going to take this path that has now ended up with you having everything confiscated at Heathrow Airport?
Well, I decided after going to America, I thought about just continuing what I do on social media. But I started this with one goal. I wanted to change the law. I wanted to change the law around free speech. So I always aimed to fight it in court. That was my goal. I went to law school after music school. I'm probably the only kid ever to fight his parents about quitting music and to go into law school. My mom was like, please stay. She's the only Asian parent who went, no, please, son, stay in music. Don't go into law. I was like, no, mom, I'm going into law. Anyway, so this was my goal. I wanted to make a difference with the law. I wanted to change free speech laws, make it clear that we can speak and criticize a religion. And I feel like we're in a world of self-censorship. The UK is struggling with free speech. It is a massive problem at the moment. When Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, and it was a very British-sounding name, Shabana Mahmood, says that all the Tommy Robinson protesters are extreme right-wing. When the UK government website says that terrorist ideologies include anybody who opposes mass immigration, that's actually on the British government website, then we have a problem.
Okay, so it's two things simultaneously then. It's your conviction and you are indeed on a free speech crusade, and you are concerned about Islam in the West. Am I right? Is that
well? Yeah,
correct?
It's a dual-fisted approach, but I mean, I think it's pretty much the same thing. I want free speech to be able to criticize Islam. My only goal is to inflict maximum damage on Islam. That's what I've dedicated my life to. That's what I'm willing to die for.
When did you dedicate your life to that?
Very early on, when I started this, I knew what the consequences were. You piss off 2 billion people of some of the most violent religion that exists on this planet, then consequences are not so kosher.
Why would you do that?
Why would I do it? I can't live as a slave, and I can't not speak out about this. Look, the reason that I feel so duty bound to do this is I am of Korean heritage. Now, after World War II, during World War II, we were colonized by the Japanese Empire. We would not exist as a country if not for the West. Over 1,000 British soldiers died fighting for Koreans, okay? Over 37,000 Americans died fighting the Korean War, and they fought for our rights. I would be speaking Japanese, or I'd be under a midget racist dictator, Kim Jong-un, had it not been for the West. And it was a cumulative thing throughout my life. I saw the British Empire getting absolutely shat on, and when I first learned about, which you're never taught in school, how the British Empire ended slavery in 1807 with William Wilberforce. That's incredible. It's the kindest empire to have ever existed. It's the only empire that goes out colonizing countries with exporting democracy at the same time, essentially sealing its own death in some ways. It's the empire that fought so many other empires to stop slavery. They fought the French, Spanish, Portuguese, and even the Arab empires to stop slavery. Now, why does the British Empire take sole responsibility for slavery, when actually the Arab Empire traded slavery for longer and had more slaves than the British Empire? They traded slaves for 1,400 years. There are things that we're just not taught. The British Empire gets a lot of flack, and these countries like Pakistan, which is causing most of the problems in the UK, Pakistani Muslims, such as the child grooming gangs, they keep blaming. They have this victim mindset, which blows my mind, constantly blaming the empire. Well, guess what? Singapore and Hong Kong, former British Empire colonies, they're now economic superpowers, great culture. The only difference between us and them is their shit culture. So I I want to change the narrative from self-victimizing to something being more productive. And I believe as somebody with an Asian face, I stand up for my white brothers. I'm not embarrassed to say this. Why should I be when it is clear to me that white people invented most of the shit in this world? It's the British Empire that does so many great things for humanity. They fought World War I and II, which effectively dismantled their empire so that we can all have free lives. Of course, I'm going to stick up for the UK.
Okay, so I'll note though that Singapore has something like 14% Muslim population, significantly higher than the British Muslim population.
Yeah, but we keep them in check.
It's not a liberal country, that's for sure.
It's a dictatorship, essentially. At the beginning, Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah. I mean, they have democracy. It's not exactly a dictatorship, but it's not liberal.
Well, Lee Kuan Yew was effectively a dictator. Yeah, a good one, a bloody good one. I love him.
A benign dictator, maybe.
Yeah.
But so your answer to my question is, why are you on this, what seems to me a kamikaze mission with regard to Islam? It's actually, for you, you see as defending Britain.
It's a duty. It's an absolute duty.
Famously, Hitler and Mussolini as fascists were, I'm not sure, would you call Hitler technically a fascist or a national socialist? Was very, obviously Mussolini was a fascist, completely anti-Bolshevik.
Yeah.
And Stalin himself wrote a whole book about why Lenin was wrong, or what Lenin got wrong.
Yeah.
So they were anti-Lenin on a range thing. They were anti-Lenin, right?
Yeah.
How exactly were they?
So Marxist-Leninism, that ultimately the similarities, outweigh the differences. So a lot of times people, one, centralization of power, utility of violence, total control over the information, total control over speech, making sure that only the party is in charge. These are also the hallmarks that they all had in common. And then when people point out, when people really try to draw this huge distinction between communism and fascism / Nazism. But as I said, I think the similarities outweigh the differences. But they point to the racism because National Socialism had because in communism, the idea is that it's an internationalist movement, that essentially anybody in theory potentially could be, part of their movement. And that sounds nicer, and in many ways it is. It's more universalist. But Nazism, fascism was an idea of the important unit is the nation state and the race. And so they were much more explicitly racist. But when people really talk about that as being the major difference between that and Soviet communism, I'm kind of like, well, are you telling me that the Soviets weren't actually racist? That there wasn't actually substantial racism actually in the Soviet Union? Then I feel like you've possibly never met a Russian or know your history very well.
No, quite.
Was it less dramatic and awful than the horrors that happened under Hitler? Yes, undoubtedly. But in terms of both being totalitarian systems with very similar aspects all the way through, that it makes it a little bit ridiculous when still people on the left will say, oh, but that's that's fascism, but somehow have a soft spot for communism. It's monstrous and also bad history.
Well, we actually had Nathan Sharansky on the show when we were starting, and he's perfect. We had a good conversation about how anti-Semitism was rife throughout. I mean, even before, obviously, the communists came to power. But it seemed to me that one thing that game they did play, and now we're kind of heading away from free speech a little bit, was that
sure
whereas the communists made it about class, the Nazis made it about race.
Yes.
But they kind of played the same game. There's an oppressor group who we need to get rid of because of all the kind of evil.
And that's about the idea of the Volk, essentially, which kind of combined race and class, essentially like the Volk being the regular working people. And I actually don't think it's that divorced from freedom of speech, because when this stuff starts rearing its head and we didn't have a reckoning about being like, oh my, so Alan Charles Coors is a co-founder of FIRE, and he gave this absolutely beautiful speech that Daniel Schuckman just wrote about in the Wall Street Journal, talking about we never had our after socialism moment. We never had the moment where we said, oh my God, this was a monstrous period in human history where rights were thrown to one side, it's bathed in blood, and we never actually had the moment.
In America.
In the world. In the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that if we're refusing to, and I think in a lot of ways we have refused to actually think about this, we're going to go back into a tyranny again. So I do actually think this is closely related to free speech, because the biggest threat to free speech in the 20th century was ideology.
One thing we've covered a lot on this show is that not having reckoned with socialism and communism, and it's kind of took the wrong lessons from the Second World War, and I think we're seeing that play out in a very weird way, particularly here in America, where a lot of right wingers are interpreting that as the wrong people won. That's kind of a weird perversion of 1945. But it is the case that communism, socialism got an easy go. I mean, everyone from Karl Popper, who was not that harsh on Karl Marx.
Isn't that crazy, though? I mean, because I'm such a Karl Popper fan, but it's clear that he was raised believing that Karl Marx was essentially a nice, well-meaning man. Yeah. And he he totally savages Hegel, which I love. He totally savages Plato's Republic, which I love. And then he gets to Marx, and he's kind of like, well, you know.
He might be wrong, but, you know, his intentions are clearly in the right place. And
then in the Open Society, and it's one of like the later editions of it, there's this kind of note, I think it's like a paragraph where he says, like, the recent biography that I read, I didn't realize like he was such a terrible person.
Yes, that's correct. He does kind of put as a weird caveat, but it's not particularly heavy-handed caveat.
And it's like, and that's such an understatement. He was a horrible person.
Yeah.
Now, I say this all the time and this was one of the points in my book, Canceling of the American Mind, is that bad people can have good ideas as well. But I do find it particularly ironic that oftentimes the same people who will try to cancel David Hume for having a racist footnote in 1752 totally give Karl Marx and I think David I can't think of his name right now, but he will give Karl Marx a pass, even though he was deeply racist, incredibly anti-Semitic, even though his family was Jewish, maybe even because his family was Jewish.
But not David Hume.
But David Hume, for having a footnote, let's erase him. But Karl Marx, his heart was in the right place.
Well, actually, where I think this, Popper links to free speech, is that a lot of the attitude against free speech, I think, starts with the never again lessons from World War II.
Yeah.
And Karl Popper, I mean, viewers who regularly watch the show will maybe be bored of me talking about Karl Popper.
The paradox of tolerance?
Yes, exactly, which is a deep footnote in that book, The Open Societies, where he says, we've got to have, and the whole book argues, we've got to have freedom and liberalism, and we've got to work against authoritarianism. But in this footnote, we must not tolerate the intolerance. And it's pretty explicit in being anti. He's shown his limits there, which I think had a huge, despite it being a footnote, was hugely impactful philosophically in the idea of closing down hate speech.
And to me, like, they're not even reading the footnote right, because like the beginning of the footnote seems to be saying that we should have done more to shut down the Nazis, and there are a million different ways they could have shut down the Nazis that didn't involve going after their speech. They were murderers. It would have been incredibly easy to go after them on that. And by the way, Weimar, and this is something Popper probably didn't know or remember, Weimar Germany did punish the Nazis for speech. It wasn't the fact that Weimar was incredibly tolerant.
Is that right?
Yeah, of freedom of speech. It's called the Weimar fallacy. It even has a name. The Nazis went to jail for saying anti-Semitic things, for real. And guess what happened when they got out of jail? The Nazis would throw them a big party, and they'd turn it into a big PR coup that essentially,
because they're martyrs.
Yeah, because they're martyrs. Exactly. And so the first part of it seems to be saying we could have done more to stop the Nazis, of the footnote, and absolutely they could have. The second part gets a little bit, seems almost self-contradictory to the first part of it, but with some sort of nice sounding language about not tolerating intolerance. And
even not tolerating things that might incite intolerance.
Yeah.
So it's, again, that word incites in there. All of this language, as we're still using it.
Yeah, and I think it's used to justify things that Popper never would have supported, including, the kind of hate speech laws that we currently have. I think it's much more specific about the scenario that's exactly like...
I'm not clear about... A lot of people make this argument because a lot of the book is about... freedom and freedom of speech, but the fact that he wrote that, it might be that it was a failing in his own thinking.
Yeah,
and that it might be the case he didn't actually support all free speech.
Yeah.
So
I think it's all, if you live through the horrors of World War II, there might be some caveat or somebody sort of niggling at your consciousness, or literally someone being kind of like, "Hey, maybe you should make a footnote about this." It's like, fine,
right.
But I think the overall, I think his overall oeuvre is about freedom, with a caveat that ended up being, again, in a footnote, which probably should have been ignored to a large degree because it's a freaking footnote, but has been leapt on by people to say basically, well, this justifies my entire anti-free speech, anti-open society regime.
Yeah.
Which he'd probably be pretty horrified by.
The footnote that changed the West.
Yes.
It's very interesting what happened, very tragic and very interesting what happens on the Indian subcontinent, which is that you see Muhammad bin Qasim writing back to his immediate superior, who is the governor of Iraq.
Who's Muhammad bin Qasim?
He's the one that conquers Sindh province in the beginning of the 8th century. He's under orders, convert or kill. Convert or kill. That's the option for the Hindus, because they're considered pagan peoples and they don't have a book that Islam recognizes at some level. And he basically communicates that it's impossible. You can't do this. It's not a practical thing to do. So grudgingly they apply the poll tax, the jizya, and the rules of the Sharia for non-Muslims.
So he thought it was not practical. Is there any indication that he thought it was not moral?
I haven't seen anything like that. He thought it was not practical, and but there were extensive massacres until that modus vivendi was worked out.
So these were the Hindus of northern Indian subcontinent.
Exactly, northwest.
Okay, so do we have any? How long were they there? How long were the Muslim conquerors there? Was this they uninterrupted to the modern day, or?
Oh, they went into Afghanistan, and there was conversion there of indigenous peoples, and those become loosely Turkic tribes that adopt Islam and continue these conquests.
Were those what were the Afghans' religion before?
Lot were Hindu. Hindu.
Okay.
And some were just nomads and may have had no religion. So you see that Afghanistan, as the jihad continues on the Indian subcontinent, and then there was a great conqueror from the Muslim perspective, a horror for the Hindus, Mahmud of Ghazni, in Afghanistan, and he begins pushing the conquests further into what we know as modern India, and those are very, very devastating conquests at the beginning of the 11th century, and then his successors ultimately set up what was called the Delhi Sultanate. I'm sorry, and that lasts from 1206 to 1526, and that's succeeded by the Mughals. And all these jihad campaigns, Winston, are very, very devastating. That massive killing, massive enslavement, massive destruction of religious structures, Hindu religious structures. And then there's even a period, late 12th, early 13th century, where basically, but for the Himalayas, I guess, would have gone into Nepal. You see the destruction of Buddhism in northern India, and again, pagan people, very, very destructive of their religious structures, and this is northern India, and so you see Hindu civilization and Buddhist civilization bear the brunt of these jihad campaigns as well, and that's rarely discussed, other than by by Hindus in India and Buddhists.
Oh, so you've looked at the sources, the original sources for of the non-Muslims.
Yeah. So you have two sets of sources. You have the very triumphal Muslim sources, which in many respects, I think there's a certain honesty, maybe some exaggeration, but not seeing these what we would look at and certainly in through a modern lens as horrific, brutal conquests. They're very much celebrated. The numbers of Hindus killed are celebrated.
So do we have a sense of what the numbers were?
Yeah. So what happened was, and this became very controversial. Although I was in preparation for this interview, I was rereading some of the debates. There's a great Indian historian of Islam, K.S. Lal, and he calculated using whatever available demographic sources he could muster, and he documents them all. And some of it is very theoretical, very speculative, but his calculation was that in the period between 1000 and 1500 CE, there were about 80 million Hindus slaughtered in that period. And so this, of course, you can imagine in the modern era, there were all kinds of attempts, particularly by Indian Muslim historians, to discredit him, etc. And it's just recently that I read the debates, and I must say, and I may be accused of being biased, but his reposts, his rebuttals, Hilal's rebuttals are very strong. And the attempted rebuttals by these Muslim historians are very weak, almost just name calling, essentially. And Lal,
when were these debates happening? What are you referring to?
70s, the 1970s.
1970s.
And then I think Lal wrote a whole chapter in a book that came out, I believe, in the late 70s, but also academic. I mean, these things were debated appropriately, and you see academic seminars, and then the proceedings are published. And I was just reading through it's about a 20-page essay that was at one of these proceedings, where Lal is responding to the written so-called rebuttals against him, and his responses are devastating, and they're full of, again, you are forced to make estimates of how accurately do you know the total population of Hindus in this period between 1000 and 1500. A lot of it's based on, certainly not the kinds of sources we would have in the modern era, but at least he makes an effort. The response of the Muslim historians is that he's lying. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. They don't really have substantive responses. And he, I mean, it's like, fishing in a barrel. I mean, he just takes them apart.
So under the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal successors, what is life like in India then? Is it a Muslim overlord elite?
And so it's interesting you would put it that way. So the Muslim rule is the Sharia, okay, with all its restrictions on non-Muslims, there's this constant back and forth between the Muslim ulema, the clerics. They don't even like the idea that the Hindus have been granted this compromise. That, in other words, they're treated like dhimmi or zimmi is the way it's pronounced on the Indian subcontinent. They're constantly going, well, why are we granting them this? They should be slaughtered. And it goes back and forth, and obviously it comes to the same practical solution, which is that's absurd. We'll have no slaves. We'll have no means of productivity. It's an impossible task. And so, but it's just curious that you would see these debates recurring throughout this period. And then there's a lot of slaughtering of cows because cows are sacred to Hindus as a means of humiliation. That becomes another form of humiliation. What I took away was that, yes, you did get occasional rulers. The one that stands out is Akbar in the 16th century, a Mughal, who is more tolerant and is willing to reform certain aspects of the Sharia to accommodate the Hindus. But that, as you can imagine, triggers a violent response from the clerics. And ultimately, he stands out as an exception, not a rule. And the last Mughal emperor before the empire collapses is Aurangzeb, and he was one of the most brutal of all in terms of massacre and destruction of Hindu temples, etc. Now, the other part of the narrative, which I understand only in the most tenuous way, but the survival of the Hindus tells you something, is that there was constant resistance to this. The Hindus did not passively submit. And if you look at what history has shown, is they retained much of the subcontinent by dint of shedding their own blood and shedding Muslim blood too. It was very bloody, but they fought back and they resisted.
You can see that today because obviously Pakistan and Bangladesh are majority Muslim, but most of India. Well, there is a big Muslim.
Some of the
group cities like Hyderabad are majority
it's
Muslim?
Still happening. Yeah. It's still happening. There's a much more.
What do you mean it's still happening?
The Islamization is still happening. It's still continuing in India, and the Muslim population in India is steadily growing. Some elements of it are much more moderate
because of natural demographics. It's not growing because of jihad.
It's growing because of natural demographics and some cultural jihad. I think that's what goes on. And
what's cultural jihad?
I would say proselytization. Some low-level violence. You see continuous in these areas that have become Muslim majority. You see kidnapping of Hindu women and forced conversion to Islam. So I think it's not all nonviolent, but yes, most of it is just propaganda and proselytization. And then, of course, they used the Kashmir issue, which, remember, Kashmir was all Hindu. It's minority Hindu now. Even though that's one area of India that the Indian government retained because it's so critical, water, etc. Even though it had a Hindu minority, but of course it was all Hindu before the various waves of conquest.
Right. Okay.
So and Hindus have a long memory. That's what they'll say. But we don't feel that it's unjust that Kashmir is under our control. It was Hindu land.
So tell me about this end of the Muslim rule of the subcontinent. How does it get?
It's the British. It's the British. It's the Portuguese. It's really not the Hindu resistance per se. So that complicates things on the one hand, and the British, they were an imperial colonial empire. But one of the things that I found interesting is that sure, the British were imperialists too, but they were a different kind of imperialist, and you can see this from Indian historians. None of whom have any affection for British imperialism, particularly as applied to India, but they point out very clearly how. On the one hand, the British were conquerors, like conquerors are, but they at a certain point in their civilization felt compelled to preserve and even restore Hindu civilization, and that if you're gonna take the evils of colonialism, Muslim colonialism, British colonialism, Muslim colonialism in terms of its evil and its destructiveness, far outweighs what the Brits did, and you'll see this grudging admission that there were contributions that the British made in terms of preserving Hindu culture and extolling it, and that was very as someone who was researching this, that was very, very surprising to me. It's not an excuse for British colonialism, but it puts it in a different perspective.
You've mentioned a few times as you're discussing this that historians like to ignore this. Historians like to ignore that, or they paint this one-sided picture. And the way you actually describe it is that the one-sided picture they paint is the opposite of what is true. I'm curious about what you think the motivation is by those historians.
I think there's several. I think today it's kind of, it's snowballed, and it's just, that's the narrative. So if you're just a moderately, if you go to college today and you're a history major and you're studying this field, you're not going to read primary sources, which you should. That used to be the original thing. You're supposed to, but you go read this, 3-4 books by the secondary source would be, like me, okay, a modern person who supposedly consults the primary sources and then, puts it into a book form and you read it. So most people will read that. And those books now, they've been going, and the question is why, but have painted a completely different picture. A guy like Sir Stephen Runciman, for example, he wrote like 4 or 5 volumes of the Crusades, and it was considered, the bestseller, et cetera, et cetera. I think came out maybe in the 50s or 60s. And now historians will tell you, yeah, this guy really had an axe to grind, and he was just dedicated to making the Christians look bad and making the Muslims look good. All right. And how do we know this? Because the ones who have taken the time to consult the primary sources are realizing what he's saying is not there. And oftentimes the opposite is there. So why? Okay. The reason why I would argue today, it's because of what we would call political correctness. It's this desire, honestly, okay, really to bring it down where, the narrative has to always be this. Christians, whites are bad. Non-Christians, brown people are good. Okay, this is it. That's the mantra, and everything has to conform to this. Why? Okay, we can get into that, but that has been the case for, I would say, a long time, since the 60s, okay? And this sort of self-hatred thing has arose. But, there's also other reasons, academic reasons. For example, you want to be a historian, okay? The thing that would make you popular is you come up with a new interpretation. So for the longest time, the interpretation was what I'm telling you. But if I can come up with something clever, like, oh, wait, actually, Andalusia is a great beacon of light and learning. Okay, wow, then I've made a new contribution, especially if it's what people want to hear. People want to hear that narrative for the reasons I just explained. They don't want to hear about, okay, Christians and Muslims fighting because Muslims are aggressors, etc. So all of these, but, again, today in the current climate, it's just, what I'm saying right now, I don't care how my books, Sword and Scimitar, has like over 1,000 citations, endnotes, to show you where I got my stuff, because I already knew I'm going to be attacked. Where'd you get that? Where'd you get that? So the facts are there, but, people they still, till this very day, want to believe that narrative, okay? And you see it everywhere, manifestations of what I just said, this narrative. Even if you're watching the news and there's some kind of incident or criminal activity in between a black man and a white man or something, it has to be spun a certain way. So, of course, it's been going on with history, because history, people talk about fake news, and it's very important, obviously, but to me, fake history is more important, because fake news is ephemeral, and it creates its mischief, but then it, vanishes and we move on to something else. Fake history, you create overarching narratives and basically paradigms where you sift reality through. So if I've created a fake history where, Muslim-Christian relations are such that Christians were the evil aggressors and Muslims were the poor guys, well, of course, now when you talk about anything in the modern era and you see it through that lens, it all makes perfect sense and gives you more reason to despise the Christians and the Westerners, etc. And that's what's been going on for a long time, which is why I think when I discuss these things, the number one response I get from people is like, I'm embarrassed I didn't know this, why didn't I learn this in school? And this is why you didn't, because there's a narrative.
Fake news has a political agenda.
Right.
Then fake history, it's the agenda.
More profound.
It's more profound.
Yeah.
But it's still somewhat political, right?
Yeah, of course. It is political, and it manifests itself ultimately in a political way. But it's very subtle, and it's harder to prove. And, so fake news, we can argue, oh, here's evidence that this guy didn't say whatever. But fake history, who's going to take the time to delve into the primary sources, like, let's say I did? And I did it because I love it, and I was at the Library of Congress, and I had access to all those books, and I know a couple of languages, so it's not that easy to do that, and you're just going to go by. If I go to the bookstores, Barnes and Nobles, for example, and I go to the Middle East or a history section, all the books, and I'm familiar with them, they're all the politically correct books that say the exact opposite of what I'm telling you.
Yeah.
So if you mean well and you want to read a book and you educate yourself and you go to Barnes and Nobles, you're just going to, you're gonna learn the exact opposite. And that's why I always find it funny that you're better off being ignorant, because if you're ignorant, if you're an learned person, maybe just dropped high school and you didn't go to college, you're probably gonna have a better understanding of what we're talking about from an instinctual level, at least.
Yeah.
But if you go, the further you go into higher education and formally study these things, what happens is you learn the exact opposite, but then you're proud of it and you're so zealous about what you know, because I got a degree. I know this. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But what happened is you've been indoctrinated in lies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So look, you've mentioned a couple of books that have changed the popular understanding of, let's say, the Crusades and these various other moments. But could you pinpoint to a specific moment in time when the narrative changed from, as you described earlier, there was a common understanding in Europe about Islam aggression in Europe, to now where most people have no idea? Is there a moment in time where that
the transitional phase? Yeah, which is a good question. So, okay, honestly, it all really starts with, and a lot of people don't like to hear this, but with the Protestant Reformation. Okay, because with the break with the Catholic Church was a need to, I don't want to use the word demonize, but whatever, justify the break. And so anything the Catholic Church did became jaundiced and kind of bad, including the Crusades. And, the Protestants made good points, indulgences, et cetera, et cetera. I get that. That makes sense. But you got this move now where, like, whatever we can, however we can make Catholics look bad, we should. And that was the beginning. So Martin Luther, he condemned the Crusades. And then he condemned, when the Turks were actually invading Vienna or coming towards Austria, he actually said, don't fight back. And he said, this is God's way of punishing the Catholics and church, until they got close to where he was. And he actually changed his tune, literally, and wrote a new saying, no, you can't fight back. It is just war. I'm not lying to you. This is true. I can give you the evidence.
How's that for motivated reasoning?
Yeah. So it really starts with a product. And look, I don't want to get into I'm not a theologian. I'm not arguing who's right theologically. I'm just saying, as a historical development, the rift in Christendom between Protestants and Catholics created a sort of hatred towards the Crusades, okay? Because it was another thing to point at and say, oh, look. And they also, this was also the beginning of the rehabilitation of Muslims in the eyes of Europeans. Because if Muslims are the enemies of the bad guys, the Catholics, they must be good, okay? And this is why till today, it's actually Protestant nations that are suffering from Islam, because they're the ones who have completely opened their doors and who follow this logic, which is Muslims are great. It's the Catholics you got to worry about. Okay, or at least elements of it still subconsciously maybe exist. And that's why you have Muslims running amok in Scandinavia and Sweden and in the UK and in Germany. But then you look at countries like, Hungary and Poland, which is, Hungary, I know is Catholic, and so is Poland. And you don't see that sort of thing as much, of course. And I think that's so anyway, that's the beginning of it. I would say the Protestant Reformation. And again, this isn't me. I'm not talking about theology. I'm talking about historical development, which is normal, of course. And then you get the Enlightenment, right? And with the Enlightenment, all of a sudden now there's a kind of, it's not that the Muslims are good, but yeah, these Christians are fanatics. This is now Edward Gibbon, for example, and Voltaire and these guys. So now, once again, the Crusaders and their cause looks ridiculous and they're stupid. And what are they fighting over? This is dumb, etc. Okay, and then you move on until you come to sort of the modern, 19th century, 1800s. Now you have serious scholars, Orientalists. And, they just approach it in a very cold fashion. I actually like their writings. They're objective, okay? And they're looking at the sources. And they're actually better than the other guys. But you still have the influence of the sort of, the Protestant disdain for Crusades. And you have the Enlightenment disdain as well. And then you come into the modern era where, again, I think it's this need, where it comes from. I think sometime in the 60s, you get this move, this very anti-Christian thing where, Christians and Europeans and Westerners are the root of all problems. Okay. And of course, this is how the Crusades fit. So now it's being taught that way and, we're gravitating back. So now it's worse than ever because what they're doing is they're literally playing with history. I already gave you an example of all the horrors that happened before the First Crusade. In 1 year, 30,000 churches were destroyed. This is to say nothing of the killings of Christians under Hakim Amrullah, the Fatimid Caliph, or all the other ones. And they ignore all that intentionally and just tell you, Crusades just happened out of the blue, 5 centuries of peace, down the toilet. And now Muslims, can you imagine that when 9/11 and all that happened, and until now, when there's an Islamic terror attack in Europe, they try to actually associate it to the Crusades and say, well, Muslims are still upset about that. They have grievances. Okay. And they don't. I mean, because Muslims are not idiots. They actually respect the Crusades in the sense that, oh, okay, there was a time when Christians fought back. Oh, okay, good for them. But I mean, everything is being done, to just rewire everything so it fits that narrative.
These are, be it environmentalism as well as the trans issue, is that these seem to be sort of quasi pseudo religions, and part of it, in my opinion, and this certainly applies to Britain, where we're now minority Christian country. Atheism, when the new atheist movement was highly successful, and atheism massively on the rise. There's a God-shaped hole, and that these different ideologies have come up. With not complete religions with many flaws, but are filling that gap, which is why people are so passionate and zealous about it.
That's right. And we Peter Boghossian, our mutual friend Peter Boghossian and I, we've done now 2 taxonomies of wokeism. One is a taxonomy of woke religion, looking at religious categories and how they explain climate, race, trans. And we just did one on psychopathologies, particularly the cluster B personality disorders of particularly narcissism and antisocial personality disorder, but also borderline and histrionic, and looked at, so you can provide a lot of explanation of woke ideologies as a kind of psychopathology, also as a religion. But I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think that we asked one thing on that, we asked Abigail to help us figure out that what was trans, how was it a religious movement? And I think she took like a year. I think we'd already published the taxonomy, but she came back and she said, trans provides an alternative soul, a secular soul. So the idea that there's this, in Christianity or in other religions, the idea is that you have a soul, the soul lives on after you die. It was there before you were born, probably. Maybe some dispute about that, but that there's a soul. Well, if you're atheist and we think that you're reconstructing a new religion, gender becomes the new soul. So and of course not everybody has a soul. Some people that are cisgender people don't get one apparently, but trans people have a gendered soul that is the opposite of your physical body. And so in that sense, a kind of spiritual idea gets reconstructed through gender ideology.
If I can rewind one moment, because I'm quite interested in this idea of the psychological, not only psychological types, and this is something you're excellent at public, is to bring in the psychological nature of why people make certain decisions. For your famous piece, there's narcissism of Justin Trudeau.
Oh yeah, Trudeau,
which went viral. But so you bring up those borderline personality disorders, narcissist personality disorders. I don't know if you've read, there's a book by Simon Baron-Cohen, who's the comedian Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin and is a Cambridge professor, looking at the science of evil and actually looking at these specific cases and how they can take can take grip of people and can even grow in certain societies. So I'm quite curious. Do you think what power those extreme examples of I guess mental disorders are at play in the gender, in these different quasi-religious movements that have recently emerged?
Yeah, great question. Well, so we're very interested in, so there's, just to split things up, there's psychiatric disorders, which you would include things like anxiety disorders, ADHD, there's depression. There's also what's often referred to as serious or severe mental illness. That's like schizophrenia, severe bipolar, depression. And then there's something else, which are called personality disorders. They're also in the DSM. All these things are in the DSM, but personality disorders are viewed as psychiatric disorders you can get over. If you're suffering from a lot of anxiety, I think the vast majority of people, exercise a good diet, a purposeful life, many loving relationships, friends and family, can solve a lot of anxiety disorders. Some people may need some medicine. That's fine. But you can overcome psychiatric disorders. Serious mental illness, you're living with your whole life. Personality disorders, you're also living with your whole life. So if you are I think it's always helpful to think of these as on a spectrum. So if you're high on antisocial personality disorder, you tend to have much lower levels of fear, much lower levels of empathy for other people. If you're high on narcissism, you're much higher on a sense of grandiosity, my importance in the world relative to other people, a sense of entitlement. And there's other categories that we looked at that all come from the DSM.
Is Machiavellian in there, or sadism, is that sort of part of it? Or is that a separate sort of?
Well, there's something it's controversial, a new area that people are studying. I think personality disorders are less controversial, but it's evolved a bit. But there is this idea that there's cluster B personality disorders, include those four I was mentioning: narcissism, antisocial, histrionic, and the dark triad then is narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism is just what it sounds like. The ends justify the means. You're using people, and I think some of the controversy with the dark triad or the dark tetrad is whether those three things are all the same thing, whether they're actually can be coupled. But there's been a bunch of good work on it. One of the most interesting papers actually came out on narcissism last year. And Jordan Peterson sent me all these things. So we were looking at them. He's on, and he had, in fact, we did an interview with one of his grad students is named Christine Brophy. We did a fascinating interview with her because she did a review of all this literature. And I think she did some of her own original psychological research. But really out of the 60s was this idea that there's only right-wing authoritarianism. There was this idea that there is no left-wing authoritarianism. Well, that was a problem because, of course, you have communism, which is...
Half the world were literally underneath left-wing authoritarianism, and they're like, talk about blind spots.
Well, and there's even an argument, I don't know where I come down on, which I don't even know it matters, but where there's like, is Nazism even a right-wing ideology, or is it really a version of a left-wing ideology? But the new research finds that left-wing authoritarians, people that, support socialist dictators or people that support censorship, you think there should be a committee to decide what you should be allowed to say. Though that it's almost identical with narcissism. And you can sort of see why, which is that you have a strong sense of entitlement. I see this on the censorship stuff all the time. Of course, we the good people should decide what you're allowed to say and hear on social media platforms. That's a sense of entitlement, sense of grandiosity. And then there's a kind of psychopathy or antisocial part of it, which is that they don't really care or even think about the impact on other people. They say they do, but really it's about feeling powerful and domineering. So, lo and behold, the ideology that claims to be more caring and compassionate for the vulnerable actually ends up caring the least about them. And we see it in the WPATH files. The moment that things go sideways, they say, oh, well, that's the fault of the patients. They just have to take responsibility for the choices that they made.
So how is it that, I'm assuming that there aren't that many people who have these personality disorders. Like, I'm assuming it's a small, single digit percentage. How is it that they then accumulate in such power? Or is it that all of us have that ability to, or that potential to have these traits?
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum. And so when you're saying, I think people that get categorized as having narcissistic personality disorder, they score the highest on a questionnaire that they're supposed to do with a therapist. So same thing with antisocial. So by the way, political correctness affects everybody, including the American Psychiatric Association. So they stopped saying psychopathy. And I think the switch from DSM-4 to 5 was from psychopathy to antisocial personality disorder. So
because that's politically incorrect.
Psychopathy, it's a euphemistic treadmill. Yeah, euphemistic treadmill is that you don't call people psychopaths. But
sorry, what does euphemistic treadmill mean?
Oh, do you know what euphemistic treadmill? Yeah. Euphemistic treadmill is it's where you words get these connotations over time, and then you decide that the word is the problem. So it's you can't say retarded. You can say, developmentally delayed until that becomes, it's not. And then the latest of the euphemistic treadmill is you're not supposed to say addicts. You're supposed to say people with substance use disorder. You're not supposed to say mentally ill. You're mentally ill people. You're supposed to say people with.
I was once
serious
told
mental
off for
illness.
saying brainstorming and saying that I was told that was offensive to people who have what's it called when you spaz out,
Right.
to use the politically incorrect term, and that the better term was mind shower, and have a mind shower because that's less offensive.
I mean, I think the person that said that to you, I don't think that they actually care about the feelings of the people they claim to be protecting. That's a way for them to gain
Power.
advantage over you in the conversation.
Control, yeah.
I was very. I mean, this is we're sidebarring, but I mean, I'm very interested in how. So we're sort of getting this question: how do these guys get power? Part of it's through language, and I think it's like the left is so good at language. The left, I think, which is disproportionately, has more of the intellectual class as the universities. They spend a lot of time creating the right language. That's a manipulative language so that you think you're agreeing with something, then you discover later, that doesn't mean quite what I thought it means. Equity is a good example. If you agree with equity, most people think it just means like, I think I'm agreeing to equality of opportunity. No, you're agreeing to equality of outcomes. Completely different thing that actually may undermine the equality of opportunity part, as we've seen, with racial preferences in hiring and admissions. So to your question, how did they do this? There is, according to the Ponerology book, in this book which is really a study of totalitarianism or a study of evil, he says people with these personality disorders, he calls them characterological disorders, but they're personality disorders, particularly the narcissists and the psychopaths, they end up working together in a sense in these institutions. The narcissist will sort of mesmerize you. They're the charismatic intellectuals. They're the ones that really, oh my God, it's so exciting. Trans, it's they're often the intellectuals at the universities. They bedazzle you. You're really thrilled by it. You feel like they're selling you liberation. And then the psychopaths are the ones who will just fire your ass if you don't conform.
Lord Nazir Ahmed was Lord of Rotherham, a Labour Party peer. In 2002, he was convicted for underage child sex abuse. Go and look at the BBC article. It's a headline story.
No.
The only reason that didn't capture our imagination is because obviously, I said 2002, 2022. We've come off the back of COVID and everything. We've been very distracted. If you've got the power to compromise politicians, such as members of our House of Lords, by having them come into those sorts of environments where this criminal conduct is being perpetrated, you've then got them engaged in criminal sex acts, right? And then as an organized gang, you can then manipulate them. This is exactly how
you think Ahmed was manipulated by an organized gang?
Well, he was certainly manipulated. The fact that by the end of it, how he got caught, he was basically molesting boys.
He got sentenced to 3.5 years and he's convicted for raping a 9-year-old boy. He only served 6 months.
Yeah. Well, by the way, this is exactly how the Krays operated, and we know from the historic story of the Krays that they were manipulating politicians. But this is exactly how they operated. This is, if anyone looks into the Krays, you can see it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a well-known, tried and tested technique, and that is called, it has a political science term. It's called compromat with a K, right? And that is you acquire this compromising material over politicians like Lord Nazir Ahmed so that you can then say, hang it over them, right, over their heads and say, I've got this on you. You need to do what I say.
So this is a whole other dynamic
Yeah.
because, of course, people following will understand that the grooming gang scandal, it's kind of completely in the whole fabric of our nation. It wasn't just a failure of the ideology of mass migration, of multiculturalism, or it's a failure of multiculturalism, I say, but it's also local police failed, local council failed, politicians failed. But now it's also, I hadn't put this dynamic in it, but also that these gangs were deliberately capturing politicians.
Local police and local councils and social services didn't fail.
They didn't.
They were complicit. Failure indicates that they were caught off guard and didn't know how to behave. Maggie Oliver, who is a former police detective who was investigating a lot of these underage rape grooming gang cases makes the very same allegation, that they were covering it up. That's different to failing. Failing would indicate a mistake. Covering it up indicates deliberate intent. Now, of course, not every single police officer, not every single local councillor, and not every single care worker is complicit. That's like not every single British Pakistani Muslim is complicit. Let's stop being emotional about this conversation. Nobody is alleging every single Pakistani in Britain is a sex pest. Every single police officer is a criminal, corrupt, bribe taker. Every single local councillor is a paedophile. Nobody's alleging that. Let's make that very clear. Mm-hmm. We're saying that there are points of failure in police, in local councils, in care workers, and in Westminster politicians, and in our local Pakistani British communities. Those points of failure are complicit, not accidental. They were deliberately set up to fail because this was an organised operation, not just on the street level with the British Pakistani gangs, but actually this organisation went through into the police, into the councils, and into the care workers. And how this was covered up. So the scandal, credit where credit is due. Elon Musk interfered with how we do politics in this country by trying to unseat Nigel Farage, but credit where it's due because he raised it at least and has had this The scandal isn't that this had happened. What Elon may or may not have known is we knew this had happened a long time ago. Everyone was aware of the grooming gang scandal. The Times newspaper ran a front page on it. The scandal now, the current 2025 scandal, is the cover-up. And that's why Maggie Oliver's voice is so important. Because the cover-up was orchestrated because Keir Starmer, as Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, and that, for those who aren't British, that's the head of our Crown Prosecution Service. The Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, he makes the decision whom to prosecute and who not to prosecute, right? And they are allowed, in the name of public interest, not to prosecute certain cases. That's one of their criteria. Keir Starmer was the DPP, director of that at the time, and chose not to prosecute a very well-known case in these underage rape grooming gang scandal cases. He chose not to prosecute it despite the fact that the DNA of the man was found on the girl's underwear. He chose not to prosecute. Maggie Oliver makes this very specific allegation, but it's also a matter of record anyway, right? Now, there's an example of the cover-up, right? That's the same Keir Starmer who chose not to prosecute Sir Jimmy Savile when he was DPP. That's the same Keir Starmer who now, despite all of this having come out, wants to appoint Lord Mandelson as our ambassador to America, despite the fact Mandelson is known, not in dispute, known to have visited Epstein's Island, to have gone to Epstein's mansion in New York after Epstein's conviction, and to have gone to Paris with Epstein for his birthday. Now, all of this doesn't imply guilt for Mandelson. What it means is there are many, many questions that require answers. And it does point to a cover-up. And so finally, I'll say, that's why we need, and it's a demand, it's no longer a request. We are demanding, and they can't run from this, they can't hide from this. We will not retreat, we will not surrender. Because the children are more important. We don't care. They can bring anything, they can throw anything at us. The children are more important. We are demanding a national inquiry. And if Starmer doesn't get out of our way, there will be a national inquiry on his head. We are demanding a national inquiry because what I've raised here, they're all questions. I'm not accusing Starmer of being a paedophile. I'm not accusing Mandelson of being a paedophile. I'm saying there are questions that need to be answered, and only a national inquiry can answer those questions. It looks to me like, and listen, I called 2020 with Trump. I called Ukraine. I called COVID, and I've suffered for it. I'm prepared to take the hit. This looks to me like there was a cover-up, and there are questions that need answers.
I want to ask about Tommy Robinson. From your perspective as a Muslim growing up in Luton and living in Luton, when you hear about Tommy Robinson and what he's getting up to, what were your thoughts? How was he portrayed as a person? What was he thought of within Luton, within the Pakistani community?
So I didn't know what his issue was. I was told he's a racist, he hates Muslims, he hates all of us, brown people. That's all I knew. I never knew his story. I never knew where he's coming from. I never knew what happened. Now, when I look back, that wasn't the full truth, right? Because actually, my understanding is like he knew someone who was groomed, and actually he saw behaviors where there were extremists and stuff like that, and none of that was spoken about at all. He was like the image of someone who hates us. Like he's the Hitler, right? He's trying to get us. He's trying to kill us all. That is what I was told. That he's the bad guy. And it's taken me so many years to look into actually what is he saying? Oh, I didn't know that. Was it his cousin that was groomed? Oh, actually, he's talking about extremists here, and was there funding from outside of this extremist organization in Luton? Never knew that, right? So there was more to the story, but we weren't told that.
So you changed your opinion on him?
So I'm going to reserve judgment until I meet him. I do plan to have a chat with him because I think it's impossible to reunite this country when Tommy Robinson is a big figure that a lot of people in the country do look up to. He does have a massive following on X, like 1.4 million people. And I feel like it's impossible to unite this country without him giving me a chance or me giving him a chance. So that conversation needs to happen at some point. We will see what happens.
Now, I know I've asked a little bit about how your personal journey, but it's now that I've heard you and talk about various topics and trying to put it all together, you're clearly a free thinker, and you clearly have great courage to take the narrow path, let's say. No?
Courage, a little bit, but yeah.
Well, I wondered, I asked a little bit what about the sort of breaking point to sort of speak out on YouTube, but I wondered, you talk about what happened when you were 16 years old, and then the picture you get in Luton of characters like Tommy Robinson. But was there a moment where you sort of started to come out as the patriot, the British patriot that you are, that you actually sort of rejected some of the more extreme things you were hearing? Was there a moment in your life where that happened?
So everything that I am is because of all the life experiences that I have. But one recent moment was a spark for me where I think was like, oh, do you know what? Maybe my attitude's not right. So I had a Muslim British-born Pakistani manager very recently. And when the whole Israel versus Palestine thing happened, and of course I was condemning, all the children are dying, and I was a pro-Palestinian at the time.
Is this since October 7th or before?
This is after 7th October. I didn't know what happened on 7th October. I didn't know the detail. All I knew was that Israel was bombing Palestine, and I was like, oh my God, children are dying, and the mosques are being, the hospitals. And I was like, I jumped on that bandwagon. Of course, and that is disgusting. I condemn that. But I was one of those people who was behaving as if I've got a chip on my shoulder and blaming Britain and all that kind of stuff. And then my British Pakistani Muslim manager said one thing to me in the one-to-one that we had. He's like, just make sure you don't have a us versus them mentality. He just said that to me, that little thing.
Who's the us and them in that?
Muslims and everyone else. And I didn't realize I was displaying those behaviors. So, but because I was quite honest with him about how I'm thinking, I'm like, this, and because I had to take a short leave from work because of the images of the children in Gaza, like the blown up bodies and stuff like that psychologically messed me up. I had to get tablets to tackle my anxiety. So then I was honest with him about how I'm feeling, like, oh my God, it's crazy, and Britain's supplying weapons to Israel. Like we need to do all this. And I was a pro-Palestinian at the time. And then my mind, that was the spark. And I was like, oh my God. Then I started self-reflecting on everything. Then I researched. I listened to what happened on 7th October. I listened to the Israel side. I looked critically at the Palestinian, the Hamas side, what they did. And then what I did on my YouTube channel, I was like, you know what? If they've raped women or if they've taken hostages that are like women and children, that's actually very un-Islamic. So then I made a video saying, can all the Muslims like come out and condemn Hamas and the rapes and all that? Because that's un-Islamic. And then what I found is that the majority of Muslims had a go at me. They're like, oh, but the Palestinians are oppressed people. I'm like, yeah, but if they're oppressed people, doesn't mean that they can do un-Islamic stuff. Like, surely you should condemn the un-Islamic acts. And they didn't. And then I decided not to become a pro-Palestinian. So yes, I still condemn, of course, all the deaths in Gaza, but I also condemn 7th October. I support the good humans on both sides. I don't care what religion they are, what country they are. Like, I don't care. And I condemn the bad people on both sides. That is my stance now. Because I'm sorry, I'm not supporting people who are doing something un-Islamic and then the other Muslims are not even condemning them. Like, I feel like it's very selective how Muslims choose to condemn people and don't condemn people.
Certainly, I've heard that the beginning of the immigration crisis, and I believe this, started with Tony Blair. What do you think was in the water then? What happened under New Labour that kick this all off?
So Tony Blair, I think, is one of the brightest and most damaging, dangerous human beings that has ever been near power in this country. And I say I think we all know why he's damaging. But the reason I say he's bright is he either fluked this or he was able to see how he could get his ideology so embedded in our structures that it would become a devil's job to revoke what he's done. And he effectively, in my view, circumvented the constitutional principle. I know we don't have a written constitution, but we have a constitutional principle that no parliament can bind a successor parliament, that every parliament must have the right, when it comes into office, when you get a new parliament after a general election, it must have the right to do whatever it wishes to do, unfettered by any past law. And so what he did was remove powers from Parliament. And he did it in a number of ways. The first was to create all these quangos with which we now have to live. His first example of doing it was giving the Bank of England independence. And he said, we've got to give the Bank of England independence because we've had boom bust and politicians are not good with money. So we need an independent set of experts running monetary policy. So we're going to take it away from the meddling politicians and give it to the experts. And to the untrained, unknowing eye in 1998 when he did it, you think, well, that kind of makes sense, right? Mm. But he also did it with the Human Rights Act, where he embedded in the Human Rights Act of 1998 the European Convention of Human Rights, gave the European Court of Human Rights supremacy over all British courts. So we now have an unelected court abroad. And he did it through signing international treaties, signing us up into international institutions. Obviously, he was a great Europhile. And, we abrogated a great deal of our ability to govern ourselves to the European Union. And through these mechanisms, the creation of independent bodies like Ofcom, for example, he took power away from politicians. He took scrutiny away from the people. He made it impossible for the people through their elected representatives to change the way the country is governed. And he embedded his own form of stakeholder capitalism, governance, etc. And so now, as I'm sure you would have heard it said many times, and you'll be more aware of it than I am, whenever we wish to do anything domestically, people say, well, you can't do that because you breach international law, or we'd become a pariah state. We'd be the only European country not to be a member of the European Convention of Human Rights. Do you want to be alongside Belarus and Russia? These kind of arguments. But it was inherent in the British system that no parliament could bind a successor parliament. And that's what Tony Blair succeeded in doing. And the Conservatives, sadly, even though David Cameron, when he came to office, said he was going to revoke a lot of that, he didn't do it. He said he was going to abolish Ofcom. He didn't do it. And he gave it more powers. I think he put the post office is now governed by Ofcom. He gave it more power, and George Osborne created the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the entity that opines on Chancellor's budgets. And Labour, I don't know if you're aware of this, when somebody was in the King's Speech, which is their, intended legislative agenda, is going to give make it a legal requirement for chancellors to get the OBR to sign off their budgets. Now, that's basically saying to government...
This is Starmer. This is now.
This is Starmer. So monetary policy has gone to the Bank of England, and soon fiscal policy won't be allowed to be made without the OBR signing off on it. So in government, what does government have? One of its biggest levers is fiscal policy. It used to be monetary policy, fiscal policy, regulations and laws, right? You neuter the ability to make regulations and laws by binding ourselves into international institutions and legal treaties and so on. You neuter the ability to influence monetary policy by handing it over to Andrew Bailey, who so adeptly cut Liz Truss off at her knees when she wanted to do something he didn't quite like. And now you give away fiscal policy to the OBR. Yeah. The Parliament... What's the point of the government?
Yeah. What's the point of democracy?
What's the point of democracy? What is the point of democracy?
Yeah. How do we understand Keir Starmer in this? Is it Blair plus socialism? Is it just a continuation of Blairism? How do you make of our Prime Minister?
So Starmer, I think, is an unreconstructed communist. I think he stands against the state. First of all, he's anti-British. And that a lot of people will look at this and hear this and say, "Oh God, swivel-eyed, alarmist nonsense." No, he's anti-British.
Well, give an example of why he's anti-British.
He's anti-British because he's inherently a Europhile, and it was one thing to vote Remain when we were part of the European Union, but we are now out. To be a Europhile now is basically to say to the British people, and he is a Europhile, whether or not he admits it, is to say to the British people, I want to give governance of this country away to a third power, and I want to take our borders down so that we can have freedom of movement with that third power, and I'm going to give up our currency to their currency. I'm going to give up complete control of our monetary policy.
He's not saying that.
But he's a Europhile. He's not saying it, but I know that's where he is. He has said when he was off, when he thought he was off camera in Montreal in September 2023. Are you aware of this?
Tell me. This is the Davos thing.
No, not that was Emily Maitlis. That was another great one. No, off camera he said, if I am to become prime minister, I will align us so closely to the European Union that we might as well be a member. That was in September 2023. You cannot wish to do that to your own country. There cannot be a case made, a legitimate case made, that is pro-British, which gives over governance to a third party. There will always be things that we need to do as a country that's different to the European Union or different to Germany, France, and whatever. And we must retain the ability to do it. And if you're prepared to give that up, you are inherently anti-British. That's how I see it. And so Starmer, I think, is anti-British. He's anti-free enterprise. We saw that in the budget because the employers' national insurance increases that she brought in, brought in, does not affect the public sector. She carved out the public sector. It's only for the private sector.
They have no idea. They're all bureaucrats. They have no idea. The example as you're speaking was, I'm reminded of his quote with Maitlis about Davos, which is that he prefers being in Davos than Westminster.
I know.
Which
it's extraordinary.
Westminster, the palace of democracy.
Absolutely.
The voice of the people. And no, he'd rather be in Davos with the unelected, rub shoulders with the lobbyists and the bureaucrat, all the corporate power, and
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think to be a conspiracy theorist requires you to be quite an optimist, actually, because it presumes that people can think things through and get together and make plans. And life is much messier than that. But with the World Economic Forum, effectively what you've got is the richest people in the world coming together with the most powerful people in the world, meeting behind closed doors, having discussions, of which there are no minutes. That no good ever came from big money being in bed with big power. It is a very dangerous thing.
It's more dangerous because what information we do have, and I took the time to read Klaus Schwab's books, and it's terrifying. This particular thing that really stood out, and I think this is relevant to what you said about Tony Blair and stakeholder capitalism, but certainly to Davos and being anti the people, as Keir Starmer is. There's a whole chapter, I think it's in the Great Reset or it's in one of the books about how we need to set up new morals and values, as if we don't have religion to do that.
Yeah.
We need new morals and values. And the only thing that all of humanity have in common that we can grant, that can be the mooring, that can be the God to build a new moral structure above, is the climate crisis. And he says throughout all the literature, Klaus Schwab, it's climate crisis, almost every other sentence. So it's a terrifying world who want to not just have control.
It's Orwellian, isn't it?
They want to create new morals for us.
Yeah.
As if we the people
And they're doing it
ourselves.
it is absolutely straight out of 1984. You need an external enemy. In this case, it's climate change. And it's man-made climate change. You're the problem. You, humanity, you're the problem. Yeah. Therefore, this is the solution. And you, as you rightly say, we have to adopt a whole new way of living and a whole new set of values.
Yeah. I understand also that you met Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes.
What happened?
Well, the headline of this story would be, I'm a terrible judge of character, and yet I was totally creeped out by him. And this was long before the story broke, long. It was the day before the 9/11 attack. And I was leaving the next, I had to write a column that night. I have 2 speeches I was flying off to the next day. Never made it. It's the morning of 9/11. And I had to go to an event down on Madison Avenue. I was on the Upper East Side. pouring rain, pre-Uber, couldn't get a cab. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to walk 50 blocks to get home in the pouring rain. And a limo pulls up and the guy leans out from the backseat. Cars are moving at like 5 miles per hour and says, "Hey, Ann Coulter, I'll give you a ride. We know people in common." He named someone that I do know. Not that good a recommendation, but I do know her. And I thought, what's going to happen? The car's going 5 miles per hour. I can always leap out. So I get in the back of the car. We go past.
That's a very brave thing to do, to get into a stranger's car, I'd say. Well, you were sufficiently convinced by whatever the name was.
I was sufficiently desperate to get home.
Right, okay.
Again, pre-Uber. And raining, no cabs.
Okay.
We went past his house, which you've surely seen, the largest private residence. It used to be a private girls' school in New York. And he said, "I live here." And I said, "You do not." And he said, "Come in, we'll have tea. Don't worry, my car will wait for you and take you the rest of the way," which wasn't that far anyway. And I just wanted to call BS on him. So I went in, and what was two things were striking about it. No books. And, pre-Uber, this was also pre-Kindle. That I've always noticed that in people's apartments when they have no books. And then I asked him something that occurred to no journalist to ask him, "How did you make your money?" And he was very flippant about it. Well, I invest money for rich people. And it was, I don't know, he was just so goofy and frivolous. I've known a lot of very rich people, whether billionaires or centimillionaires, and you have, and they are not frivolous like this. In fact, the ones I know, I'm sure there are exceptions, are constantly thinking, working. They can be funny. They can do other stuff and have hobbies, but they're not frivolous like this guy was. And I thought it was creepy enough that as proof, I had his car drop me off, not at my apartment, but a few blocks away. So the doorman thought I was crazy. I walk in, "Oh, hi, I'm back." Wait for the car to go away. And then I walked. It was just a few more blocks from my place.
Because you didn't want the driver to get your address.
And then and I was right, for the next 6 months, people who knew Epstein could get my email from TV stations like Alan Dershowitz. And I started getting, all these emails from people like Dershowitz. "Jeffrey Epstein wants to get in touch with you. Jeffrey Epstein wants to get in touch with you." And I was just creeped out. No, there's something weird about this guy. This is before any of this broke. I didn't see any young girls around. There was no Ghislaine Maxwell there. And then, years later, not that many years later, a few years later, I happened to be down in Palm Beach when the Jeffrey Epstein story broke. And I think it's kind of weird that the Miami Herald, good for her, that Julie Brown or something, won the Pulitzer Prize for her story in whatever year it was, 2017, 18, for the Jeffrey Epstein stuff she wrote about. I don't even respect the Palm Beach Post, but they had the full story in 2006. And I thought it was kind of a big story. I wrote about it not as specifically as this story. It was just how it was more on how biased the DA was in Palm Beach. He had just spent 4 years going after Rush Limbaugh for back pain pills, but he lets off this pederast. And I did get Bill O'Reilly on Fox News to do a segment on it, and it was fantastic, and he was great. And he ended the segment saying, "And I'm going to stay on top of this story. I'm watching this DA." I'll get back to what the slap on the wrist was, but it was a Democrat DA.
Do you remember the name?
Barry Krishner.
Okay.
And every time I'd run into O'Reilly, and sometimes I'd do a show, but I just run into him in the halls at Fox and say, "Hey, when are you doing that follow-up story on Epstein?" "Oh, yeah, we're getting to it." I don't think he ever did a follow-up. But I was telling everybody in the media, this is kind of a big story, utterly, completely ignored by the mainstream media. And I think it's because Epstein was a huge Democratic donor. Barry Krishner, the DA, or as they call them, state attorney in West Palm Beach, huge Democratic donor. I knew the chief of police down there, and he told me, he may have told the press, that when they were first, what happened was some mothers from West Palm Beach came over and contacted the Palm Beach police and said her daughter suddenly had a lot of money, that her daughter and her friends' daughters were giving erotic massages and having sex with a rich man on the island of Palm Beach for money. And most of these girls were coming from broken families, if not runaways. They were they were troubled girls, but young enough for Jeffrey. So the Palm Beach police start looking into it, and it was a massive, brilliant investigation with Epstein having no idea what was going on. They had his trash picked up and directly delivered to the police station. They're going to through all of his trash. From one girl, they interviewed another girl. They ended up with like 17, I may have the number slightly wrong, but affidavits from the victims themselves and some of the slightly older enablers, the like 20-year-old girls who were the ones going around finding the young girls, and the young girls would ask their other girlfriends, hey, want to make some easy money? A lot of detail on how they were recruited, what was done to them. Then they also interviewed the butler at Jeffrey Epstein's mansion, and he reported that he'd go into the massage room after Jeffrey Epstein had been in there with young girls and find things like a large black dildo. Can I say that on this program?
And you can say whatever you want.
I'm just quoting an eyewitness report. They found in the trash things like, as for whether he knew they were 14. Oh my gosh, did he know they were 14? So there would be things like deliver flowers to, this 15-year-old girl after she performs in the school play. So-and-so is coming late today because she has soccer practice. So they had him totally dead to rights. So they don't tell Barry Krishner, the district attorney or state attorney, they don't tell him who it is yet. The investigation is ongoing. They got to keep it all under wraps, but they do tell him this is what we're investigating. And Krishner's really, really excited about this. This is fantastic. We're going to get one of these billionaires. I'm sure he's resentful of these rich people living on Palm Beach. Yes, keep going, get all this stuff. He's signing off on everything. He's getting the warrants for everything. And then they deliver it to him on a silver platter. He sees it Jeffrey Epstein and basically refuses to pursue anything. So
what year is that?
That it has to have been 2006.
After the first charge. Oh, no.
Those were the first charges.
Okay.
So it would have been, I think, 2006. Okay. The trial wouldn't take that long. So Barry Krishner does it before. He presents to the grand jury. He presents to the jury. It was all closed. We don't know what he said, but the only thing the jury came back with was, I think it was one count of soliciting prostitution. So soliciting, not doing it. And you're calling these 14-year-old girls prostitutes. And all he got was a slap on the wrist, not 1 day in jail, not registered as a sex offender. So the chief of police, Chief Ryder, was bullshit. He was furious about this. He's giving interviews. He's looking for some other way around this. Now, as you know, we have the state system and the federal system. Obviously, sex crimes in Palm Beach, one mansion in Palm Beach, that's a state case. It's not a federal case. I don't think they knew yet, or if they knew, they didn't have the details on the flights to Lolita Island, the transporting girls, New York, Palm
which would have
Beach,
made it federal.
But still, the U.S. attorney for, I don't know, I guess Miami, whoever the U.S. attorney is down there, this Alex Acosta, he sees the case and says, okay, we're going to take it. We'll make it a federal case. And he has reported, he's the one who's been, that the Miami Herald, the reason it came up in 2017 again, after the media ignoring it for a decade, was because Alex Acosta, the U.S. attorney, did not get a very rough deal. I mean, way better than what the DA got. He got Epstein registered as a sex offender, struck a plea bargain with him. I forget what the charges were, but it was a charge and it was a state charge. It's weird. The federal government got him to plead guilty to a state charge. So the state would impose the penalty, but here we have the plea bargain. And that's when Jeffrey Epstein was assigned. This is out of the U.S. attorney's hands. It goes back to, Barry Krishner. And he gets 13 months in a private wing of the West Palm Beach jail. I think it was 13 months. Maybe I'm confusing the two 13s. Yeah, and then 12 hours at home every day.
Yeah.
It wasn't punishment at all. So that's what the media finally got obsessed with. And why? Because the U.S. attorney was a Trump appointee. They finally had a way to tie this entirely Democratic story to Donald Trump and one of his cabinet appointees. So Acosta's now on the hot seat. He has to defend himself. And he says, our office has never come under so much pressure. Jeffrey Epstein had so many lawyers working for him, calling us, threatening us, following my attorneys home, following the assistant DAs. They would have, the black car following them. We know where you live. And one of the things he said was, he was told, I don't know if it was by one of Epstein's attorneys, I think it was from someone in the State Department, called him and said, leave it alone. Epstein is intelligence.
Yes, that's been reported. There's not I haven't heard that, but or it's not official, right? It's not like we don't know for sure that was said, but it's been reported that was said.
And it should be investigatable. I mean, I'm guessing, even going back that far,
Yes.
State Department records
Right.
should be
Oh, so
receivable.
Right.
Or discoverable. You could put Alex Acosta on the stand and ask him, among other things, who called you?
Yes.
Why can't we find that out? I mean, that's a pretty big bombshell. And what's being done to investigate it?
I'm talking about, for example, slavery, and the fact that Islamic slavery was far worse than anything that happened in the West. The Atlantic slave trade. The Islamic slavery, they shipped 17 million, the top figure. Arabs shipped 17 million black Africans to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire, to Arabia, and further afield.
Over what period? That was
Centuries earlier than anything that started by the Europeans. Starting from before the 7th century, when Islam set in, and there was a higher death rate because it involved the castration of young black males, and there was no anesthetic, and thousands died, millions died on the way. So it was gruesome, and and abolition movement did not take root in the Islamic world. In the Ottoman Empire, there was firm resistance to it. Whereas it's very much a Western concept, abolition. It was very much a Western Christian initiative. People like William Wilberforce and Henry Thornton and so on. The Quakers especially, but it did not resonate with the Islamic world.
We'll come back to your point about why you feel inhibited from speaking today, but I kind of want to explore this history because I think some listeners and viewers might not really have a very good understanding of Islamic history necessarily, and we can go all the way to Muhammad, and maybe we'll come to that later, but seeing as we're on slavery, it seems to me that post-Muhammad, up until the slave trade and beyond, it's a very bloody history. And if you look at the Islamic wars moving from the Arabian Peninsula and or the Islamic, I guess, colonialist imperial project, all the way to India, where 110 million Mughals, have I got that right, were killed, i.e. the biggest genocide in human history. 110 million Sikhs were killed under the Mughal Empire. Can you paint a bit of a picture that for people who don't necessarily know the Islam history?
The traditional dates to start the Islamic Empire began really at the death of the Prophet Muhammad. It was 632 AD after Christ. And it spread very, very quickly to North Africa, then the Byzantine Empire, which was slowly taken over. And then they got as far as Poitiers in France, and they conquered most of Spain and so on. By the time that they overran, there were the Berber dynasties in North Africa, and then they arrived at the gates of India also in the 8th century with Mahmud of Ghazni and so on. And then later on, the Mughals didn't arrive until late 15th century. But soon, they were overrunning most of what used to be the classical world, Rome and Greece and so on.
I made a mistake earlier. It was actually the Hindus as well as the Sikhs. I didn't, but sorry, in India. But forgive me. So it was the genocide of the Hindus in India. I made a mistake earlier saying it was the Sikhs, but there's a bloody history that doesn't seem that we have either completely forgotten or never really knew about in the West. There's an amnesia or something that's going on that we in denial of it. I wonder even if Muslims today are aware of the bloody conquest of Islam.
The most tolerant Mughal emperor was Emperor Akbar. He actually turned against Islam. He was an apostate emperor. He encouraged Hinduism. He had lots of Hindu wives and so on. He renounced Islam. But he was followed immediately by his grandson, it must have been, I guess, Aurangzeb. I forget the dates now. In the 17th century, he was the most intolerant of all the Mughals. This is following Akbar, who was the most tolerant, to Aurangzeb, who he destroyed. I have lots of statistics for the number of temples, Hindu temples destroyed. This was known as the Furor Islamicus to Indian art historians. The destruction committed by the intolerant Muslims who didn't want anything to do with the idolatry, as they termed it, of the Hindus. So they went around trying to eradicate Hinduism from the subcontinent.
What about then slavery? Coming back to slavery, is there a sense that Islam has dealt with that? In the West, the last few years, the issue of slavery has been brought up, and the part played by the West and the slavery in America, trying to atone for those sins, has become a very important part of the discourse. Is there any such discourse in the Islamic world?
Not at all. Not at all. Not an ounce of self-doubt or self-questioning. There's no self-criticism in Islam. It's considered a taboo subject. The United States, the total number of slaves who came, 12 million were shipped across the Atlantic. Do you know how many came to the United States?
About 200,000 or 300,000, right?
388,000, exactly.
Well, the problem with that statistic is that by comparison, it's interesting because we would many people would guess a lot more. But don't forget that there were many millions who were slaved, who were the offspring and progeny of those imported.
Yes.
So it's not quite that simple. Well, maybe that's not the point you were going to make.
If you're talking about reparations, for example, only about how many white people owned slaves? Something like just under 2% of the whites actually owned black slaves. 98% of the whites are asked to pay reparations, and it's another issue, moral dimension to this. But the thing is, Islamic countries have never, ever been asked to pay reparations. And yet the United States, it had only 388,000 shipped over originally. Far more was sent across the Arabian desert. And then the West has poured in more than $400 billion into Africa since, out of a sense of guilt. $400 billion. What happened to them? Still, Africa, south of Sahara, contains some of the poorest countries. Level of education, level of healthcare, and so on. So, I mean, that's not the answer to their problems. Now, more and more African leaders are recognizing that you can't blame everything on slavery in the way that African Americans attribute all their present failures to slavery. Lack of education, lack of, breakup of marriages and so on. One-parent families, the greater number in African American. But it cannot possibly be attributed to slavery. But in fact, blacks generally, before in the 19th century, there were more black marriages than white ones, in fact.
Thomas Scholl shows that it's bizarrely, what one might think, it's from the civil rights movement later, that the fact that black African American families, there's the breakdown in families. But before then, there's actually quite high marriage rates.
Right.
So, okay, back to the issue of slavery in Islam. Is there no sense of guilt, as you described, because of something to do with the theology? Is
yes,
slavery permitted in Islam?
Yes, slavery was recognized by the Quran, definitely. Maybe it's encouraged, the manumission or the liberation of slaves is encouraged, but certainly it is there. It's accepted. It was accepted. Right up to the 1950s, there were black slaves being even now, 21st century, in the Sudan, you can find slave markets.
ISIS treated the Yazidis, take them in as slaves.
Indeed.
So that's in the scripture, you think?
It certainly it was accepted social practice, I guess. I don't know how much it depends on the theology. I don't know. I really can't remember.
If you are a Muslim, how do you deal with the scripture like that, or scripture about how they treat women, how they treat apostates, how you've previously examined? How can one tackle that difficulty?
Well, exactly. That's what I was saying earlier. You can't do it with any real honesty because if you think that the Quran is the actual literal word of God, then you would have to, somewhere along the line, you have to say, this is no longer applicable. I know it's the word of God, but that was meant for 8th century, 7th century Arabia. It's no longer applicable to us. It was designed to deal with the situation back then. Is that option available to modern Muslims? People like Khomeini would say no. It's an eternal word of God. It's applicable for always. It is your duty to promulgate these laws in the present.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Winston Marshall Show. You can click here to watch the full episode. And for more clips like this one, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, be well.